Jen Jenkins. So yeah, I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer at ENVIVA. ENVIVA is the world's largest producer of industrial grade wood pellets. Wood pellets are used as a substitute for fossil fuel in energy production, typically electricity and heat. And we have operations throughout the Southeast U.S. And I'll talk more about that. My presentation today will be in a few different parts. I'll start out by talking a little bit about ENVIVA, and then I'm going to talk about wood bioenergy and its role in decarbonizing the energy system. Then I'll talk a little bit about the forest overall and about how we at ENVIVA ensure responsible sourcing. And then if we have time, we can talk about supply chain greenhouse gas emissions, but we can certainly leave that for later and just see how we're doing on time when we get to that point. This slide should give you a little bit of a sense of who I am. I've been at ENVIVA for about 5 years. I started there in early 2016. And broadly speaking, my role at the company as Chief Sustainability Officer is to broadly responsible for environmental stewardship. And so that includes ensuring responsible sourcing for feedstock, interacting with stakeholders around regulatory policy and other items of interest for our stakeholder community, maintaining our database of greenhouse gas emissions, all the way to our recent corporate sustainability report, which we just published at the end of last month. So to start to talk about ENVIVA, this is an overview of our operational footprint. We have 9 facilities from Virginia, Southampton, all the way south to Florida, and then into Mississippi. We ship our pellets overseas. So today, all of our customers are overseas. We do ship 100%. We do export 100% of our wood pellets from our ports, our 5 ports located in these regions. And so this is a map that describes where our facilities are located. The dark green dots here are our 9 facilities. The gray dots are ports. Well, actually, the gray dot is the Waycross facility in Port of Savannah, which we just acquired from another company. The blue dots are the ports, the 5 ports, or 4 ports, including Savannah, the 5th one. These light green dots, one in Bethesda, Maryland, where I'm located, and then one in Raleigh. These are sort of corporate headquarters locations. And then the orange are facilities under development. So our Lucedale facility is currently under construction, should be completed by about the middle of next year. And our Pascagoula port is in the same state. And EPS is just a little bit behind Lucedale. In terms of the broader industry, at the end of last year, we were at about 4 million tons of pellets a year. With the acquisition of the Georgia Biomass facility, which is called today ENVIVA Waycross, because we did acquire it over the summer, we're now at about 5 million tons of pellets a year. The construction of the new facilities, as you can see there in Lucedale and EPS, would bring us to about 6.5 million tons a year of wood pellets, and that's the capacity we expect to have by 2024. And as you can see here, these are the largest suppliers of wood pellets worldwide. Right? So obviously, ENVIVA's the largest in the world. The next largest today is Pinnacle, which has operations in Western Canada, and then also they have part ownership in a facility in the U.S. And the same is true of Greenville, which is based primarily in the Baltics. I think I mentioned our pellets are exported primarily. Our pellets are exported, right? And our customers today, as you can see at the bottom of this graph, are in Europe. Ørsted is in Denmark. Lynamith and Drax are in the UK. Engie is in Belgium. And so this was our 2019 contract mix. In 2024, we'll have a lot more diverse customers. Increasingly, we'll be delivering our pellets into Asia and customers in Japan. Okay, so I'll move into a discussion about just wood bioenergy and the role of bioenergy in the decarbonization of the overall electric grid. So why bioenergy? And I want to first point your attention to this set of graphs from the IPCC. So this came from the IPCC special report that came out at the end of 2018 on the global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. And one of the things that the IPCC pointed out here is, yeah, you're going to need the forestry sector, or the agricultural, forestry, and land use sector, a FOLU, in order to get down to net zero. But you're also going to need a significant amount of BECCS, or bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. And so just, a couple things to note here. You can get to you're never going to be able to decarbonize completely, right? There are some sources that are going to be just really, really hard and very, very difficult to decarbonize fully. Some of the, shipping is one example. Air travel is another. So you're going to need negative emissions at some point. And so this bioenergy with carbon capture and storage is an important component. Also, the other piece here is IPCC in its 1.5-degree report. It did include bioenergy in every single one of the scenarios in order to achieve a low carbon future, right? And to get to 1.5 degrees, in order to avoid the worst consequences of climate change. So IPCC has recognized the importance of bioenergy. And one of the reasons IPCC does recognize the importance of bioenergy has to do with this question of intermittency. So this comes from a presentation made by Armand Cohen, who's the executive director of the Clean Air Task Force. And what you can see here is what they're doing is doing a trace of supply and demand for electricity in California. So this is a scenario, and they said, okay, what would it mean if we wanted to go to 100% renewable grid, and we would say half of that renewable energy would come from wind and half of that renewable energy would come from solar? And the key thing about wind and solar is that they're fantastic sources of energy, but they don't produce when the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining. So in this scenario, looking at, let's just assume we're going to half and half wind and solar, we have the solid line here is the demand of electricity. So this is how much electricity needs to be delivered in order to meet the needs of the people there in California. And then the dotted line is how much energy is being produced at a given time by the energy grid, assuming we're looking at just wind and solar. And a couple things was that you can see here is, yeah, in the spring and summer, we have more supply than we do demand, spring and early summer, because we have, plenty of sun, plenty of wind. But there are important parts of the year, really, for the whole fall and winter, from sort of mid-September all the way into, mid-March here, where there's more demand than there is supply. So in order to meet that demand, what California needs is a source of either storage, which is today prohibitively expensive, especially in the sort of amount that they would need in order to meet all that demand instantaneously at any given time, or a source of dispatchable fuel or dispatchable power, right? And you can have dispatchable power. You can, there are lots of sources of dispatchable power, right? There's, on the renewable side, you could have geothermal, you could have hydro, another source of dispatchable power. Nuclear is a good one. Fossil, certainly a good source of dispatchable power. Or you could have biomass. Right? So biomass, in our view, is an important component of a transition to a renewable energy future. Another example of biomass as a dispatchable source here is, this is a trait on the bottom right of this graph is, and I know this is hard to read, I'm sorry, if you have a small screen. This is from the UK energy grid, and I got this from a colleague at Drax Power, which is an important energy provider in the UK. And you can see here the wind line. This is from a weekend in April. And it's sort of describing what the sources are of energy over this, sort of 72-hour period. So the solar line, you can see, is these sort of dark green olive colored lines that sort of go up in the middle of the day on Saturday and Sunday. The wind line is the blue one that sort of is kind of, the light blue one is kind of low on the screen and then goes up a little bit on Sunday afternoon and into Monday. The demand is obviously the highest line, this highest blue line. But the key thing is, look at these sources of power. They don't all happen at the same time, and they may or may not overlap. Right? So you do need something where you can fill in the gaps at the times when solar and wind may not be available. On the left here, this is a description from the Energy Information Association of how much of our U.S. grid today comes from the various sources of renewable energy, and so it breaks down biomass. So of the renewable energy, which makes up today about 11% of our national grid, biomass is just under half. Biomass is growing, right? So this is a report from the International Renewable Energy Agency, which came out last year, and it's basically its base case here is saying that you need, in order to achieve the renewable energy case by 2050, it's calling for a tripling in the use of bioenergy. Breathe, comments, thoughts, questions?
I have a question. This is Brian. Jennifer, are you saying, or am I interpreting this correctly, that you see bio as a kind of a stopgap, assuming that the storage of renewables doesn't get sorted out and we find some kind of breakthrough in the next decade or so? Or where's the long-term view that you have as that intermix with these other less constant renewable sources?
Yeah, so in a world without cost-effective storage, right, you do need some kind of dispatchable source in order to fill in the gaps in a cost-effective way, right? And so for many facilities, there are, Drax's facilities, for example, have been 3 out of the 4 sort of boilers and towers that they have been converted from coal over to biomass completely. And so that is, so they have switched from coal over to biomass, and that was a cost-effective transition that they could make, and they could make it immediately, right? They didn't have to wait for that coal asset to sort of decline. And so depending on the mix that one has and the sort of availability of other resources, we find that biomass is effectively and cost effectively part of the mix, right? It's not the whole solution. We're not saying it's going to be, we're not going to be able to convert and displace all the coal with biomass. That's not realistic, and it's not desirable. But it is an important part of the solution.
And maybe a follow-up. Can you give me a rough ballpark, the amount of greenhouse gases produced per megawatt of biomass produced energy versus coal? Is there some comparison there, more or less about the same?
Yeah, there is. At the end of the last part of my presentation here, I have 4 or 5 slides that are all about the greenhouse gas emissions associated with biomass. And some of them I think might compare with coal, for sure.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Anybody else? So having talked a little bit about Enviva and our business, and a little bit about the sort of the role for wood bioenergy in decarbonizing the energy system, I'm going to move on to talking about wood pellets and sort of how they fit into the U.S. forest system overall. There we go. Okay. So the first thing to know here on the right, what I'm showing you is a map, again, from the Energy Information Administration does I think it's monthly actually, a report on the production of wood pellets and sort of densified wood fuel is what they call it from the different regions of the country. So each one of these green dots is a wood pellet production facility, and then the red dots are sort of temporarily not in operation, and then the yellow one, there's one yellow one here that's a facility under construction. And you can see, yeah, the highest capacity today for wood pellet production is in the Southeast, and that is about 8 to 10 million tons a year of wood pellets are produced in that region, and the vast majority of them are obviously for the utility grade market. The heating ones are used typically for home heating, might be in your grill or in your wood stove at home. And of those, obviously, the vast majority are produced for export. People ask us a lot, what is the potential of wood pellet production in the Southeast U.S. and how do you know? And so I wanted to show you this graph on the left that basically shows the sort of pellet production and gives us a sense of what given the market for wood products and the forest products industry in the Southeast U.S., what the capacity might be for the wood pellet production in this region. And the conclusion that these researchers came to, and it was in Wageningen University in the Netherlands, what they found was that the wood pellet capacity in the Southeast U.S. was probably on the order of 30 to 35 million tons a year, without disrupting sort of the existing forest products market, and without impinging on sustainability and environmental protection. And so if you think about, so we're right now at about 8 to 10. We have somewhere between a 3 or 4 times what we could produce, 3 to 4 times the amount that is being produced now of wood pellets in this region. I'll talk a little bit more about the different markets for wood products when I get a little further into the presentation. One key thing to remember, actually, as I'm going to go back here, I think one key thing to remember about the Southeast U.S. is that it is one of the world's, and you live in this region, right? So you're aware the forest products market is incredibly important to the overall economy, and it is the Southeast U.S. is one of the world's most important wood baskets. So the Southeast U.S. is responsible for about 1/6 of the wood products that are used annually around the world. And so, that's a lot of wood. There's a lot of wood that's available, and it's an important part of wood, obviously, and forests are an important part of the landscape. And the industry really is obviously an important economic driver in the region for both landowners and others who operate there. And one of the things that's true, right? Landowners respond to strong markets for their products by growing more trees, right? It's if you think about an agricultural commodity, the way that you get more of something is not to use less of it, right? The way you get to more, for example, if we wanted more chickens in the world, right, or if people were eating more chickens, right, you wouldn't have fewer chickens, you would make more chickens, right? It's the same thing with forests and trees. So as markets for forest products are stronger, landowners respond to strong markets for forest products by growing more trees. And that's what we see here. So this graph shows you the trends in forest inventory, which is the standing amount of wood and carbon in the forest from 1953 all the way to basically the present day. You can see here this orange line at the bottom is the amount of removals from timberland for all products. And then this blue line that's climbing, we've had a doubling in forest inventory since 1953, since record keeping began. And again, that's attributable in large part to strong markets for forest products. At the same time, you can look at a breakdown of what products are being, what products are being extracted from the forest. And the saw timber here is another word for, high value tree. So a saw timber tree is a big one. It's sound. It might be tall. It's useful it can be milled into high value products that may be stored for a long time. So furniture, construction materials, 2x4s, those are saw timber trees can be made into those materials. And you can see the trends in harvest for saw timber. And you can see this decline. Markets are important, right? So the decline here in 2007, 2008 is due to the drop off in the housing market due to the global financial crisis. Pulp markets are a little more robust, a little more constant. And so removals for pulpwood have remained roughly constant through time. And obviously you can see that, we also use a lot of pulp. Pulp is used for things like paper, packaging, fluff pulp, that's the absorbent material used in diapers, that kind of thing. The pellet market began, in earnest, really. It's fairly new with respect to the forest products industry. The rest of the industry has been around for probably a couple hundred years, right? But the pellet market is new. And it began in earnest, with to be measurable, and the use of its use of feedstock began to be measurable in about 2010. And you can see even today, it's responsible for about 3% of the overall harvest in the Southeast U.S. So again, this is a hugely important wood basket, and pellets are a very, very minor proportion of the removals that are happening here. So the graph I just showed you was for the whole Southeast, right? For Virginia south to Florida, the whole region, all those 13 states. What I'm showing you here is the same thing, except just within ENVIVA'S sourcing regions. So this is specific to our sourcing regions. And you can see the blue stars here are our mills, and then the black outline is the region from which our mills and our operations are using feedstock. And so the graph on the right shows trends in inventory and removals for all those different kinds of materials. So the solid lines are inventory, and you can see the trends in inventory from 2000 to basically the present day. And again, we're seeing an increase in the overall inventory, and the pulpwood inventory is orange here, and the saw timber inventory is green. And then removals. And so note that removals are about the same today as they were in 2000, although there was again a small dip around the time of the economic crisis in 2007 to 2009. Note at the bottom, the pellet mill removals again have been began to be measurable about 10 years ago and have been increasing ever since. So note I said over the whole region, the whole Southeast, 3% of the overall removals are attributable to pellets. Within ENVIVA'S sourcing regions, that number is about 10%. So I'll stop here and ask if there are any questions about what I've talked about there with respect to the forest products industry and the role of pellets in it.
Jennifer, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I put a headset on, so I just want to make sure I was still coming through. I do have one. What are some of the most common arguments against biomass and wood pellets that you may come across, and how do you and ENVIVA respond to them? And you may cover this more in the next segment, but I just figured I'd go ahead and prompt the question there.
I mean, probably. It sounds like, Kelly, you're asking sort of what are we're familiar with criticism, right? If you've been around energy in the Southeast, you know that wood pellets can be sort of a hot topic. I think probably the biggest misconception that people have is around deforestation, right? And I think people often confuse just a standard harvest in a regular working forest with a conversion of forest to another land use, right? So there's a lot of concern around ensuring that forests remain as forests, and that we sort of maintain these really important systems for the carbon storage benefit that they can offer. And I think what a lot of people are sort of maybe not understanding is the difference between all the different kinds of forest ecosystems that we have in the world, right? So, for example, an area like the Southeast U.S., where working forests have been the norm for, ever since sort of European contact, right, are different, right? And they're under cultivation, and we're in sort of the 6th or 7th rotation for many of these forests, and they're production forests, and they're useful. They provide a steady stream of products into the human economy, products that we use, right? If you get a box from Amazon, that's a forest product right there. And they confuse that with sort of the deforestation and harvesting of, giant old growth timber from a tropical region, which is a much different situation, right? And so it's important for us to recognize that the system we're operating in is a working forest system, and not to confuse a standard harvest with deforestation, where you lose carbon and you're never going to get it back.
Okay, thank you.
So let me talk a little bit about how we at ENVIVA ensure that we're using good biomass to make our pellets. What does that mean to us, right? Our mission is displace coal, fight climate change, grow more trees, right? These are the things we wake up in the morning every day, and that's what we live by. And so in order to fight climate change, we need to make sure that our sourcing does not contribute to a loss of carbon from the forest. And so here's the way we do that. The wood that we use is low value wood. It's a byproduct, typically a byproduct of a traditional timber harvest, right? So I think, remember how I said there's saw timber and then there's pulpwood from a standard timber harvest. Every single harvest and every acre of working forest in the Southeast U.S. produces, or it should, produces both kinds of wood, right? You have high value wood, which can be used to make longer lived products, and then you have lower value wood, and that's sort of tops and limbs, smaller trees that don't meet the specs for a sawmill. And that's what we're using, right? Is the tops and the limbs, the things that don't meet the specs for a sawmill. Thinnings is another great example. We also use byproducts from a industrial processing facility, from byproducts from a sawmill. So about between 15 and 20%, I think in our most recent data set, it was about 17% of our incoming feedstock comes from sawdust and shavings that are delivered to us from a sawmill as a byproduct of the sawmilling process. We don't use wood that could be used for another high value, longer lived product. We ensure that harvest practices safeguard biodiversity. That's an important part of our sourcing. And we also make sure that every tract that we touch will be returned to forest and will not be converted to another use. That's what I was talking about before. And good biomass also needs to come from a region where forest carbon stocks are stable or increasing. In other words, harvest cannot exceed growth, right? Growth has to exceed harvest in the areas where we operate. So in late 2018, we finalized our responsible sourcing policy, and then last year in mid-2019, we rolled that out. And our responsible sourcing policy has 3 parts. The first part is our commitment to sustainable forestry standards, and these are the decisions that we make on a tract-by-tract basis when we decide to take or not take wood from a given harvest. So we actually have we have a team of about 30 to 35 foresters whose job is to is to buy wood and make sure that the mills, you know, have enough feedstock to operate. But they also, our sourcing procedures rely on tract by tract interrogation and investigation to ensure that for every tract we touch, harvest was the right outcome for that tract at that time. And so as part of our track and trace process, before wood can cross the scales at one of our mills, the supplier and the landowner have to deliver information about that tract and about that harvest to one of our procurement foresters. And the procurement forester makes a decision about whether that tract, you know, whether we're willing to take that wood. You can't deliver wood to ENVIVA without having gone through that process, without having that information in place. So we ensure that the forest source must be replanted or regrown, will not be converted. We ensure that water quality is protected through adherence with BMPs. We ensure that high conservation values and biodiversity are not threatened by harvest activities. The second component of our responsible sourcing policy is our commitment to transparency and verification. And so we do maintain third-party certification and verification standards, and we have them third-party audited so that we can be held accountable to them and hold ourselves accountable to them. We have our track and trace system, which gives our stakeholders visibility into our sourcing. So we actually publish information about each one of our tracks on our website through our track and trace system. I invite you to take a look at that. We also, every year at the beginning of the year, so our responsible sourcing policy lays out, in a sense, sort of the North Star and what we intend to achieve with our sourcing. And every year we lay out goals and quantitative commitments about what we will accomplish in that year in order to achieve, move ourselves closer to the goals we laid out in the RSP. And so we commit, as part of our commitment to transparency, to report at the beginning of the year on what we intend to accomplish, in the middle of the year on how it's going, and then at the end of the year on how we did, right, whether we met our goals. And we also, of course, pledge to seek opportunities to continuously improve, because nobody is perfect. And then the last component of our responsible sourcing policy is work that we do together with others in our sourcing region. So remember, this is forest products industry is huge in this region. Pellets are responsible for a small minority of the sourcing. We recognize we do have an influence, but we also, some of the issues that our stakeholders are most concerned about in our region are things that we can't influence alone, right? So we need to work with others in order to do things like ensure that the amount of forest land stays stable or increasing at the regional scale. We need to work with others to make sure that wetland ecosystems and peatlands and high carbon systems are conserved. Conversion of forest types that provide high quality habitat is a very important issue in our region, right? The demand for pine is real, and it's because pine is the most commercially valuable species. So one of the things we need to make sure is that demand for pine does not cause people to cut down other biodiverse forests and plant pine instead. But we're not the only ones who are part of that system, right? So we have to work with others to raise the level of collective awareness about those issues. And then critical, threatened, or declining forest types are also an issue in this region. This is one of the important biodiversity hotspots. And so we recognize the forest products industry and its role in ensuring that those forest types stay on the landscape. So there's more to say on all those things. I invite you to take a look at our sustainability report, actually, that was just put out. I think I have a link to it later. But in the light of the question earlier on greenhouse gas accounting, greenhouse gas accounting is an important issue for us, right, in our work to fight climate change. How do we know that we're contributing to that fight? The first thing I want to do is point your attention to a paper that we put out in May. This white paper describes our view on accounting for the emissions from wood pellets as they relate to the sort of forest context in which they occur, right? So this paper goes into a lot of detail about all the things that I'll talk about in not very much detail here today. So I invite you to take a look at that at the link provided. The first thing is, so the wood bioenergy life cycle, right? So if we start at the left, you have, and I'm leaving aside the carbon recaptured in forest growth and the biogenic emissions to the atmosphere. I'll cover that separately, and that's actually those two big arrows, are the topic of the Seeing the Forest white paper. I'll talk about that in a second. But the supply chain really sort of starts in the forest with forest harvesting. And so the emissions from the equipment, right, the chainsaws and other harvesting equipment that's used, we measure that. We also measure the emissions associated with feedstock transport on the trucks to the mill. There's emissions associated with pellet production. This is largely from the electricity, right? So at ENVIVA, we actually inherit the grid factor for electricity because we do plug into the electric grid. And in the Southeast, as many of you know, it's a grid that's heavy to coal. It's not the cleanest. Pellet transport to the port is another, sort of the transport emissions associated with that. There's emissions associated with the storage and handling at the load port. That's on the U.S. side. Emissions associated with shipping, and then once the pellets are offloaded at the customer site, then there's transport to the power station. And all of those emissions are counted, and those are our supply chain emissions. So this piece right there, and then at the stack, the convention that we use in the EU and in the UK and in every place where this question has been sort of addressed by a stakeholder, by a policy process that has involved numerous stakeholders, the conclusion has been that you count the biogenic emissions, the stack emissions from the biomass, you count them as zero when they are released from the stack. And the reason you do that is because those emissions are already counted in the forest where the biomass was grown, right? So as long as your carbon stocks in the source region are stable or increasing, then you know that then you're safe to set those emissions from the stack to zero, right? And the reason we do that has to do with, this is described a lot more in the Seeing the Forest white paper, the way the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change handles emissions from all the sectors, right? So at a country level, the inventories from each country are divided into sectors, and the land sector is separate from the energy sector, right? And so and all of the emissions associated with any process on the land sector are captured in the land sector inventory accounts, and they're measured as changes in net carbon storage on the land sector. So any emissions or sequestration that is attributable to any forest product is captured when you take the net carbon stock change over time in the forest sector, in the EFOLU sector. When a material like wood pellets crosses the boundary from the land sector into the energy sector, it would not make sense to count the emissions from that land sector product again in the energy sector, right? To do that would be double counting. You've already captured any emissions associated with those wood pellets when you measured and counted and reported the land sector forest stock change. So that's the reason why we set the biogenic emissions to zero at the stack. We don't set all those other supply chain emissions to zero at the stack, right? And so those are the emissions from up and down the supply chain are captured, and those are described here. And if you're interested in learning more about that, again, there's a link down here at the bottom this slide, where you can learn more about our supply chain emissions and how we've reported them. This was the comparison between coal and natural gas. So if you look, I'm looking at the pie chart up here at the right. So the pelletizing emissions are about half, right? So this is the pelletizing emissions are that's the electricity associated with running the pellet mills, right? And so that's the largest source of supply chain emissions. The second largest source here is about a third of the supply chain emissions are associated with transport of the pellets across the ocean. And so that's what this sort of rust-colored wedge in the pie is. And then the transport, the harvest activities make up about 5%. Feedstock transport, right, from the harvest site to the mill is just under 10%. And then this product use is that's the sort of methane and N2O emissions from the use of the biogenic feedstock, right? We don't count the CO2 emissions, but we do count the methane and N2O, and that's the 3%. And then compared to coal, so this is the carbon intensity per pellet per megajoule of energy embedded in that pellet, right? Carbon intensity for coal is 112, liquefied natural gas about 66, and then the biomass here 9.7, and that is including, and that 9.7, just to be clear, is just the supply chain emissions that I showed you, right, from the feedstock transport over to the port. And then
Jennifer,
in terms of, yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. I'll let you finish that.
Yeah, just in terms of in the power terms, because I think the question earlier was about what is the power production, per megajoule. Our customer Drax, right, is producing based on our pellets, right? So using all the assumptions from a feedstock, from a pellets produced at our Ahoskie mill and delivered to the port at Drax, 26 grams of CO2 equivalent per megajoule of electricity. So that's the answer to that question. Okay, yes.
And there was another question posed in the chat box. It is, are there any beneficial uses for the spent fuel pellets or fired waste?
So our customers, that ideally our customers don't have anything left over, right? The most efficient for them, the most efficient thing would be to completely combust those pellets and turn everything into energy. There is some ash left over, right? There probably is a very, very small amount of ash. And I'm sure there are some beneficial uses for that small amount of ash, but that's not something that I would be prepared to speak to, actually, not being at that customer site myself.
And you said that this is, you guys export 100% of your products. Do you see the U.S. market, gaining interest in this kind of thing?
Yeah, it would be great. I would love it if the U.S. would, sort of get on board. I think the places where our market has been best developed are countries where they have a pretty aggressive approach to greenhouse gas emissions reduction, right? So these are places with, well-developed policy incentives and, sort of good reasons and, opportunities for power plants to sort of convert. Hopefully, right? And as we move into a new administration, there may be more opportunities for climate action, and that would lead to more incentives for facilities to do more conversions. I think that would be fantastic. It hasn't been the case up to now.
And we did have some feedback from the previous question. Steve Noblock, who is an engineer with Wilson Engineering, said there's some land use benefit for ash for agriculture use, primarily as a replacement for lime. And he was just providing us an example, so maybe help with some of the fired waste question.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I think we have when we have ash actually at some of our facilities as well, a small amount, and we do have agricultural uses for that as well. People pull up their trucks and they fill them full of good stuff that they can use that we're getting rid of. That's good.
Jennifer,
Anything else?
This is Brian again. That calculation or the logic that you explained about the stack emissions equaling out or canceling out the portion over in the forest. I forget what the name of different buckets were that you're mentioning, but am I understanding correctly that you're saying the CO2 emissions generated by burning one tree worth of pellets is directly equivalent to the carbon capture capability of the same tree in a forest? Or is that not what you were saying?
I mean, the idea is right, but I don't think I would necessarily say one tree to one tree. I think the best way to think about this analysis and this question is at the regional scale, right? So forests are managed at the regional scale to provide a steady stream of products into the human economy, right? So every year, there's new demand for new products, and so foresters will, you move. Let's say you had 50 acres, right, and you had 50 years worth of demand. So every year you're going to harvest 1 acre, and you'll travel from 1 acre, and then the next year you'll harvest the second acre, but the previous year's worth of acres is going to be regrowing, right? And then you move to the next acre, the third year, and the previous 2 years are regrowing, right? So you have you need to think about it as sort of a consistent renewing cycle. So every year you have simultaneous harvest and regrowth, right? At a regional scale. So in the Southeast US, we have about the growth to drain ratio is about 1.7. So that means that every year about 1.7 trees or 1.7 tons of trees or 1.7 acres, that pick whatever metric, but 1.7 units are coming back for every unit that is taken out, right? And that's happening simultaneously. So the emissions from the pellets that are burned at the stack have been those emissions were already counted when you counted the sequestration and emissions balance in the region where the pellets were grown. There's actually when you think about the fact that every year there's more carbon on the land than there was the year before, there's a strong argument to be made, in my view, that actually pellets are net negative, right?
That's kind of what I was wondering.
Because you have more carbon. You have more carbon, right? Right, you have more carbon in the forest than you did before. But it's hard to sort of count that, and we're, I think we're happy with zero. I think it would be difficult to sort of to account for less than zero.
But I guess the key there is that you're replanting in parallel. If you cut it down and you're not replanting, then that logic is no longer valid, right?
Exactly. Yep, exactly. Or if there's more harvest than regrowth, right? If you're somehow using more of the forest than is regrowing, that's also the case. Yep.
Hi, Jennifer. This is Pratap Gaurav. Can you hear me?
I can, but barely.
Barely?
Yeah, oh, they're good.
Can you hear me better now? Or?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Okay. So who are the players involved? Like people who are harvesting and people who are planting. Are there different companies or are there different stakeholders there? How does that work?
That's a great question. So let me talk about our supply chain a little bit. In the Southeast, right, so in our region, about 87% of the land is privately owned. So these are, mom and pop, regular people who are owning about, on average, they have about 30 acres of land. So they own land for a lot of different reasons, right? A lot of them own land as a legacy, right? Or for, some of them own it for, dramatically for timber revenue. And the larger landowners, some of the private landowners will own, have larger tracts of land. But this is a privately owned landscape, and people do respond to markets by undertaking economic activity that's in their interests. We interact primarily with suppliers. So there's a network of brokers, right? Suppliers, and they. So the way it might work is a landowner might say, okay, my timber is the saw timber on my land is mature. The saw timber is the highest value product, right? It's worth anywhere from, can be worth 8 to 10 times what the pulpwood is worth. So now that the saw timber is mature, I'm ready to harvest or arrange a harvest for my land. So they might put out a bid for a timber sale. And then there's a network of suppliers who see that maybe in the region, who see that availability of timber, and they go and well, ideally the landowner will have a consulting forester who'll help them with this process. That's ideal. And then the supplier will, there'll be a bid process where the suppliers, will bid against each other for access to that wood, and the winning bid then wins, and that supplier then goes in and on a schedule will harvest the timber. So the people that we interact with are typically the suppliers, and the supplier may, sometimes the supplier operates their own logging crew. Sometimes they're big suppliers and they do that. Sometimes they're not, and they work with freelance logging crews and freelance drivers. But that's it's a big network of folks in the industry who operate in the supply chain. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. So it's a lot of people, a lot of employment there, right? A lot of private players, a lot of big companies involved. I was just wondering, like, how do we calculate this net zeroing out of CO2 emissions, and how does that? I mean, how much is it like the blockchain technology where everything is feeding into a common database or something? Is it that sophisticated yet?
Yeah, we actually are playing around with implementing blockchain as part of our track and trace system. So that's one of our new sort of initiatives for next year. It is a complicated supply chain. It's an interesting system. And, with our track and trace program, one of the things we make sure we know is exactly where on the landscape each one of our tracks is located, right? So one of the key pieces of information we require our suppliers to share with us is the GPS location of that tract. And that's the information we map, right? So we put that on our track and trace website as part of our mapped information. So yeah, but it's a complicated supply chain, an interesting process.
Thank you.
Okay, Kelly, I think we only have a couple more minutes. So how should we proceed from here?
Does anybody else have any questions for Jennifer? If not, I have just one more. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about your career, because I know you had a big transition from government to academia and now to, the energy sector. So can you tell us a little bit how that transition happened for you?
Sure. I just put on.
It's a short story.
I'll try to be quick. I just put on the screen a link to our sustainability report. So I hope people, if they have interest, can take a look at that. So for me, I mean, I guess in a nutshell, for me, my career has always been about climate and acting on climate, right? So I started in environmental science and biology in college, and spent a couple years as a teacher, teaching environmental science and biology, and realized I was sort of teaching to the limits of my own knowledge, which led me to graduate school, where I got really developed a passion for ecosystem science and carbon cycling, right? And the reason that was so interesting for me was because it had when I studied carbon cycling and forest carbon and, you know, land atmosphere carbon exchange, it was really, wow, this could be cool. This could actually make a difference in the world. You know, like I could actually see how this might be translated into a policy. And that was right around the time carbon credits were becoming a thing, and like Waxman-Markey was a thing. And that was really sort of interesting and fun, and I could see the direct link. And so I went on just to get a PhD because learning was fun, and you know, that seemed like the thing, you know, sort of the next step for me was to continue that sort of investigative process. I did from there go, you know, I had a postdoc at the U.S. Forest Service in their inventory unit, again, translating inventory data into carbon numbers, and then went on to work in academia. Spent a few years, 7 or 8 years as a research professor at the University of Vermont, where I just loved teaching and interacting with grad students. And then found my way into policy, you know, back into policy at the EPA in the sort of 2009, you know, after, you know, during the Clean Power Plan sort of time frame. And really developed a passion, and, you know, sort of was able to continue working toward climate action, right, using forests as the tool, right, if that makes sense. Yeah, and then having been, I guess, really the nutshell is, you know, having been in government, having been in academia, I was interested in action and realized, you know, in sort of early, you know, mid 2014, 2015, that really, you know, private sector is where the real movement was, and where real action was going to be. If I was impatient, and I was, for action, I needed to be in a place where things moved quickly, and the private sector was kind of where I belonged. So that's what led me to ENVIVA, and it's been a wild ride.
Well, that dedication and enthusiasm has served you well then. But we do thank you for your time this morning and afternoon, and we are looking forward to getting to know you and ENVIVA more as one of our new members. So I will be forwarding you a copy of the presentation, and we can go from there. And there's some valuable links in your PowerPoint, so I hope that I can distribute that as well.
Yeah, you sure can. Thank you.